All right, welcome everybody. Today we are going to be diving deep and examining social and environmental safeguards, meal systems, adaptive management, and some of the tools that go into this, right? Again, we're not going to do this as sort of abstract policy frameworks, right? I'm going to give you some examples to look at them as applied tools within the environmental studies, environmental justice, and I'll use conservation again as a good case study for this. So these are, really practical instruments and tools that when are implemented well, they can shift power, they can serve justice informed research, right? That we've been talking about a lot throughout the course. And they can create accountability and prevent harm when we're, conducting research or developing projects on the ground, right? So, we'll also talk about when they're implemented poorly, right? They can become bureaucratic theater that legitimates business as usual and environmental justice violations. And, the question that we're grappling with this week is really, how do we make these tools work for environmental justice rather than against it, right? Looking for that synergy between the two. So, let's sort of start out with a concrete scenario to illustrate this for you, right? So, a renewable energy project in rural Kenya, solar or wind, right? Doesn't matter. The project promises clean electricity, right? Climate benefits, sustainable development, all the right language. But during implementation, 200 families lose access to river fishing grounds where they fished for generations, right? Maybe the project infrastructure blocked access, maybe new land use restrictions, maybe water flow patterns changed, right? The specifics could vary, but the result is the same. Their livelihoods are disrupted. So these families do what they're supposed to do. They file complaints, which, they were told is the process to follow through the grievance mechanism for the project. 47 complaints over 6 months, right? They document lost income, they request compensation or alternative access. 18 months later, 12 of those complaints remain unanswered, right? The project, meanwhile, look, it meets its energy generation targets. It wins sustainability awards from international organizations. The project reports highlight success metrics, right? Megawatts of electricity generated, carbon emissions avoided, households connected to this sustainable energy grid. But from an environmental justice perspective, what failed here, right? Again, this isn't a rhetorical question. The answer reveals what we value, what we measure, whose experiences count, right? The project succeeded on technical metrics, but it failed on the justice metrics, right? That disconnect is what we're here to examine and hopefully learn to prevent. So, environmental justice provides, a framework within the environmental justice dimensions that we've already talked about, right? These definitions, these pathways, these dimensions of justice, they can also be operationalized to conduct measurement and to create policies around safeguarding, right? They can be operationalized. And so I'm not going to, dive deep into these again. We know what they are. We've gone over them so many times. But again, these safeguards can create mandatory risk assessments around recognition, right? They could require participation processes, which could be connected directly to procedural justice, right? They can focus on equitable benefit sharing, which then connects back to distributive justice. And they can create overall accountability systems, which constructs to structural and connects across all the others, right? So if we don't have safeguards, it creates this problem where effective communities then must prove that harm occurred and that the project caused it, right? In many cases, that's nearly impossible when you're dealing with complex causation, delayed effects, or power asymmetries, not to mention dealing with the harm itself, right? With safeguards, project proponents, they must demonstrate before approval to know that no undue harm will occur, right? That's a fundamental shift. But notice that I said in principle, right? Whether safeguards actually achieve this in practice, that's another story, and that's what we're going to talk about more today. So, what are safeguards, right? Safeguards are binding operational policies that require projects seeking funding from developmental agencies, large investors, banks to identify, prevent, and mitigate harm to people and ecosystems, right? They have several core functions. They screen projects for risks to vulnerable and marginalized populations. They require impact assessments before approval, not after the fact, right? They mandate consultation with affected communities, and they establish monitoring and accountability systems, meal systems throughout implementation. They create remediation pathways, right? Plans, risk assessments, and then action plans for if harm does occur, what is going to be done, right? They're meant to be binding in nature, right? The binding is really what matters. It's not voluntary corporate social responsibility, right? The World Bank has these implementations or these requirements in place, right? If you want World Bank financing, you have to, show these safeguards. IFC investment, Green Climate Fund grants, you often have to demonstrate that you're going to follow their safeguards, right? This creates leverage. But again, leverage only matters if there's enforcement. And that's really where meal systems come in so that we can track what we're doing. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. We get into meal systems, but there's some, major safeguard framework examples I can provide you, right? This is not an exhaustive list, but this is kind of like some of the main safeguard frameworks that we can see across the field, right? So again, we mentioned the World Bank Environmental and Social Framework. This was created in 2018. This includes 10 standards and applies to about 60 to 80 billion dollars in annual lending. That's a huge amount of reach. The International Finance Corporation's performance standards. These were established in 2012. They cover private sector investment. They've really become an industry benchmark. Companies and banks adopt them even when IFC isn't directly involved because they really signal responsible practice to investors and regulators. The Green Climate Fund has climate specific safeguards, including requirements around gender and vulnerability. This really matters because climate finance is scaling rapidly, and we really need to ensure that climate solutions don't reproduce, further environmental injustice. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, they establish corporate responsibility frameworks with three pillars: protect, respect, remedy. And in this situation, states have a duty to protect against human rights abuses by third parties, including businesses. Companies have responsibility to respect human rights, and victims must have access to remedy. So these frameworks overlap, they reinforce each other, they create a global normative standard for how development and conservation projects should operate. Okay. So, when we think about safeguards as EJ tools, right, from an environmental justice perspective, safeguards are tools that really can redistribute power, right? Effective communities gain formal rights to information and consultation. Projects must respond to community concerns or document why they chose not to. Safeguards in some cases can create transparency, right? Public discourse or public disclosure of project documents, accessible information about risks and impacts. This matters because this opacity, it serves power, right? When communities don't know what's planned, they can't organize, they can't resist, they can't negotiate, right? Safeguards establish accountability, independent complaint mechanisms, these, requirements for remediation when standards are violated. This is providing recourse systems beyond hoping the project implementers will do the right thing, right? That's more and more rare, unfortunately, in this world. But again, here's the tension, right? There's an enormous implementation gap between policy and practice. Having safeguard policies doesn't guarantee that they'll be followed. Unfortunately, enforcement is often weak, right? Project approval pressures will many times override safeguard concerns, right? Communities will lack resources to monitor compliance. We really need to understand both the potential of safeguards as justice tools and going back to the political economy that often undermines that potential, right? Things can look good on paper, but if they're not actually achieving what they seek to do, they're not actually achieving just outcomes, then what is the point, right? It's performative. This is where meal comes into to play, right? And no, this is not, we're not eating, but meal stands for Haha, good joke. MEAL stands for monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, right? This is really the operational system that's going to transform these safeguards from aspirational policies into practice, right? Monitoring is this continuous tracking throughout the project cycle, right? You're collecting data regularly in a standardized format on activities, outputs, risks. This is going to enable real-time course correction and also a paper trail of what you're doing, right? A audit trail. Evaluation is going to be periodic assessment, again, going to be standardized. You're going to do typically baseline before the project starts, midline halfway through, and then end line at completion. That's a pretty standard procedure. You might have some evaluation systems that require more regular or less frequent reporting, depends on the body and the guidelines. And what you're doing is you're really looking at effectiveness, impact, and whether those intended outcomes are occurring and if unintended consequences were prevented or are starting to surface, right? Accountability is going to refer to mechanisms ensuring projects respond to affected stakeholders. Grievance systems, transparency and reporting, participation structures. This is going to close the loop between monitoring findings and making adjustments. Okay. Learning is the systematic reflection on evidence to adapt practice and improve future interventions, right? This is where you document what worked, what didn't. You're creating institutional knowledge. You're not just plowing ahead with things that are not going well, right? You're understanding why assumptions were wrong and how to do better next time, right? MEAL really has the power to transform safeguards from, again, just compliance documents filed at project approval into a living system that's really going to shape the entire project. Okay. So when we think about MEAL components in practice, we can make this a bit concrete, right? So monitoring might look like weekly water quality testing downstream from a mining operation, right? We're checking whether pollution controls are working. We could also do monthly tracking of household compensation payments in a resettlement project, right? Are payments on schedule? Are amounts correct? Daily logging of consultation meetings with participants could list disaggregated, data by gender, age, ethnicity, right? Who's actually showing up, whose voices are heard. This is very important, right? As we're tracking this in real time. You should be tracking this in any good research project, any good, environmental program. But this is really allowing us to measure specific justice indicators and collect data, right? Evaluation could look like baseline socioeconomic surveys before like a project starts, a dam construction, for example, to establish like what conditions were like before the project. Once the project starts, if you don't collect that data, it's gone. You'll never get back to that point. That's really important to think about baseline data collection. Midline assessments of like resettlement outcomes at 18 months, right? Are people reestablishing livelihoods? Are kids in school? And you can also look at end line comparison of livelihood indicators against the baseline, right? Or the control groups. Did the project make people better or worse off, right? Accountability is systems for community engagement, right? This could include grievance about database or data being accessible in local languages, right? Independent ombudsman person for complaints, someone not employed by the project. Also, public reporting on safeguard compliance. So communities have like a watchdog organization that can scrutinize performance. We'll talk about grievance mechanisms here in a moment. And then learning happens through quarterly reflection workshops where the implementing team reviews monitoring data. We talk about how we're going to adjust our approach. We could have annual knowledge sharing with similar projects. We could do documented adaptive management decisions so we can trace how and why the project evolved, right? Each component is a connected system. It's feedbacking, it's looping to the others, right? Monitoring is generating the data. Evaluation is assessing the patterns. Accountability mechanisms is looking for these problems and how they surface. And then learning translates evidence into better practice. And then we go back to monitoring, right? It's a full feedback, it's a full system. And in this space, you'll often hear talk or approaches that are related to theory of change, right? So what is a theory of change? Because this is really foundational to understanding how MEAL systems work, right? A theory of change is a comprehensive description of how and why you expect desired change to happen and a particular context, right? This is very closely related to that idea that I would just, spoke about in terms of collecting baseline data. And once you've, kind of set off from those initial stages, you can't go back, right? From a research perspective, this is really important, right? It's your hypothesis about causation. It's the basic structure following a logic chain that you can track throughout the project, right? So the way it works is there's different components and it can be adapted to different contexts and different use cases. There's a few different versions of this, but typically you have inputs that lead to activities. Activities are going to produce outputs. Outputs are going to generate outcomes, and the outcomes are going to create the desired impact that you're looking to achieve, right? So let me give you an example. So your inputs could be $2 million in funding, 10 staff members, and GPS equipment, right? Your activities are community patrols to prevent poaching, alternative livelihood training for people who previously relied on bushmeat or resource extraction, right? Your outputs are going to be measurable, smart, and I'll talk about smart later on, but what that means. But you want to aim for, we're going to say 500 people trained, 12 patrols per month, 1,000 hectares of land monitored, right? The outcomes are going to be that we want to see poaching reduced by 40% and household income increased by 25%. And then the impact, the big picture, is that wildlife populations will be stabilized and community well-being will be improved. So do you see how this is like a funnel from bigger to smaller, and that we're making these things measurable? And we would want these measurable components to be supported by data. We want them to be achievable, right? But the critical element is actually the assumptions linking each stage, right? We are assuming that trained people will actually conduct patrols, right? We are assuming that patrols will deter poaching rather than just displacing it, right? We are assuming that income increases will be sustained, not temporary, right? We are assuming wildlife populations will respond to reduce poaching pressure within this time frame, right? These assumptions are testable. This is the research component, right? That's what the meal system is actually monitoring. This is where this like connection through data is so important, right? Rather than just saying, hey, for this project, we want to see wildlife populations stabilized and community well-being improved. Great. Okay, but how? You would be surprised how many conservation programs, environmental programs, environmental assessments, mining programs, just transitions, that's pretty much where they land. Then they start the project. It's scary sometimes. Theory of change and how it connects to safeguards, right? Standard development theory of change says, project investment leads to infrastructure or services, which generates economic growth, which reduces poverty, right? This is a simple linear causation, but is our lived experience often like that? No. Safeguards complicate this, right? Because projects must simultaneously achieve intended positive outcomes, right? They must prevent negative impacts on vulnerable groups. They must restore or compensate for unavoidable harm, and they must build community capacity for future engagement, right? The theory of change for a safeguard project includes parallel pathways, right? One pathway is going to track benefits, the other tracks harm prevention. You need assumptions about, again, here it is, power dynamics, governance quality, participation effectiveness, right? Will consultation actually influence project design? Will grievance mechanisms provide remedy or just channel dissent into manageable procedures we can shove under the rug, right? There's a measurement challenge here, right? How do you quantify successful harm prevention, right? If a project didn't displace anyone because it was designed to avoid displacement, well, how do you demonstrate the value of that outcome compared to the counterfactual where displacement occurred, right? This is not just an academic puzzle. It really shapes what gets measured, what gets valued, what project teams prioritize. If harm prevention is hard to measure, it often gets less attention than quantifiable benefits, right? This is where we see justice and equity, being involved here. We're asking these critical questions. Participation can be a tool to help mitigate this. Participation is central to safeguards, right? So we need to understand what meaningful participation looks like versus what I'll call participation theater. Okay, so the traditional approach has external experts assessing impacts, right? Designing interventions, implementing projects. Communities are objects of development, they are objects of research, they are not subjects with agency. The problems are obvious once you name them, right? But this approach misses local ecological knowledge about ecosystem dynamics, social structures, livelihood strategies, things that people who live in a place understand intuitively, but outsiders may miss, right? This excludes affected communities from decisions about their own lives. And it creates dependency rather than building local capacity. That's just not a good mix of things, right? Participatory approaches say communities should co produce this knowledge, right? They should co design the interventions, they should co monitor outcomes. They are not just consulted, right? They are genuine partners and active actors within this entire process, right? But again, there's a spectrum here. At one end, you have manipulation, where participation is, let's just name it, fake. Communities are told decisions are theirs when they're already made, right? Next is informing, one-way communication, right? This is where you're kind of told what's being done. Then consultation, right? Where communities are asked for input, but have no guarantee it will be used, okay? Then you have collaboration, genuine partnership. And at the far end, you have community control, where communities are making decisions and external actors are providing only support, right? Safeguards require minimum consultation, and environmental justice demands collaboration or community control, right? This distinction matters enormously for planning and for outcomes, okay? Participatory monitoring methods are another way you can implement this, right? So, community based monitoring gives the affected communities and people tools and authority to track project impacts themselves rather than relying solely on the outcomes or the results of external actors, right? Or external monitors. Participatory mapping is a good example. This is where communities map resources, land use, sacred sites, access routes. This could be done using GPS or GIS. This is going to create documentation of community knowledge and land claims that then can be used in negotiations and legal proceedings. Citizen science, which some of you may be familiar with, involves communities collecting environmental data using standardized protocols. Water quality testing, wildlife observation, forest cover monitoring. This is generating evidence that can challenge official assessments when they're wrong, right? Participatory impact assessments means that communities are going to identify indicators that matter to them. They are going to collect the data, they are going to analyze findings, right? It's not just responding to externally defined indicators, but shaping really what gets measured within their community, right? Real examples. Indigenous mapping of Amazon territories, documented 250 million hectares between 2015 and 2020. That's an area larger than Mexico, right? This mapping has been used to secure land rights and fight illegal resource extraction. Again, we'll go back to Flint, Michigan, where the community water testing was revealing this contamination that officials were denying was happening. Residents didn't trust these official assurances, so they collected the samples and had them independently tested, right? That community monitoring exposed a public health crisis that led to criminal prosecutions that was being swept under the rug. And so these examples are strong, and they really show that communities can generate evidence that, you know, can shift power, right? That power shift is significant. That changes who has authority and what knowledge is valued. And these are only a few examples, right, of participatory research methods. There's many. And there are other specific methods that enable, further participatory evaluation, and they can take many different forms, right? You can use most significant change, which instead of predefining indicators, you ask communities again to identify stories of significant change, right? Groups discuss why particular changes matter, right? They select the most significant. This captures unexpected outcomes and community values that external evaluators will not know about or might miss, right? Participatory rural appraisal is quite cool as well, using visual tools that don't require literacy, right? So timelines can show community history, seasonal calendars showing resource availability differences, labor demands, income patterns. You can use Venn diagrams showing relationships between organizations. These tools will enable communities to analyze their own situations and communicate analysis to outsiders, right? Many other examples. I don't have time to go into all of these, but again, like an example is like when you are using these tools to reveal impacts and issues that these standard monitoring methods are very prone to miss, right? The power of these is the shift of the power, okay? But they are not without challenges, right? We need to be clear-eyed about challenges because participatory approaches are often romanticized. I'll be very honest with you. Communities are not homogenous. They are power dynamics within there are power dynamics within communities, which we are very familiar with from power mapping. Elite capture occurs where community leaders dominate processes and claim to speak for everyone while actually representing narrow interests, right? Gender, age, ethnicity, caste, class shape, who has voice, right? Representation questions are tricky. Who legitimately speaks for the community, right? In male dominated settings, as we discussed, men can monopolize consultations. Youth are frequently excluded. Marginalized subgroups lack platforms. And participatory methods require resources, time, and money. Projects face pressure to use faster, cheaper, and often extractive methods, right? And participatory approaches, they often get cut when budgets are tight or schedules are compressed. Sometimes they're the first to go, right? And there's tokenism risk, right? Participation becomes box checking without genuine influence over decisions. Communities are consulted after decisions are effectively made. Their input is documented but ignored. Best practice really requires disaggregated participation, right? Women only groups, youth groups, if that's a challenge within your specific system. Specific outreach to marginalized subgroups, long term engagement, not one off consultation, right? Shifting decision making authority to a diverse group, not just advisory roles, right? Resources for meaningful participation being allocated in the long term and sustained. That could be transportation to a meeting, childcare, compensation for people's time, right? Without these elements, participation can legitimize projects without changing any power relations or actually getting to environmental justice or justice informed problems, right? Grievance mechanisms, again, are critical and very important accountability tools that are going to provide pathways for affected people to raise concerns and seek remedies, right? So the UN established effectiveness criteria that form the design standard for grievance mechanisms. Mechanisms must be legitimate. They must be trusted by stakeholders, accountable for fair conduct. If affected communities don't trust the mechanism, they won't use it, right? They must be accessible. They must be known to effective groups. There shouldn't be barriers based on language, cost, literacy, geography, right? If filing a complaint requires internet access, literacy, travel, that's going to exclude vulnerable populations. They must be predictable, right? There should be clear procedures, timeframes, types of processes, and outcomes. Local communities need to know what to expect if they file a complaint, right? And if that's not upheld, you're going to lose the predictability and legitimacy of these processes, right? It must be equitable, right? There should be reasonable access to information and advice, no power imbalances in the process. Communities need support navigating complex procedures. They must be transparent. Parties must be informed of progress, right? Sufficient information about mechanism performance should be delivered, not just individual cases case confidentiality, but public reporting on patterns, right? They should also be rights compatible, rights within our FPIC that we discussed, right? Outcomes and remedies must accord with internationally recognized human rights and culturally appropriate, culturally and locally context appropriate rights, right? We can't settle grievances by violating other rights. That's just not going to work, right? And they must be sources of continual learning, right? The mechanism measures its own performance and adapts based on engagement and dialogue, right? Affected groups are consulted about mechanism design and performance, not just individual complaints, right? It's not operating in a bubble. Each addresses a specific way in this process that grievance mechanisms have failed historically, which is why this is very much a part of this process. So effective mechanisms typically use three-tiered structure, right? So tier one is going to operate at a project level. Community liaison officers will receive complaints. The goal is that local resolution through dialogue and problem solving is possible. Like, let's say best practice targets 80% of grievances resolved at this level within 30 days. And why local resolution? Well, it's faster, right? It's less adversarial. It builds relationships. It's often less fraught with power hierarchies, right? And it often produces better solutions because local officers understand the context, right? Tier 2 is institutional, right? So this is where there's like an independent review panel for complaints that can't be resolved locally, right? So there needs to be an investigation, mediation, binding recommendations. Timelines for these can be around 90 days, so it takes longer. And tier 3 is international accountability, right? A World Bank inspection panel, UN mechanisms. This is cases involving serious policy violations. This process can take years, right? And the critical feature is that communities can access these higher tiers if lower tiers fail, right? So there's an escalation process. But there's an emphasis on local resolution because that's where the majority of grievances really should be addressed if we're following best practices, right? But again, the structure recognizes that some issues are genuinely solvable at a local level, but others must be, escalated, requiring further institutional intervention. Okay. From an environmental justice perspective, you know, mechanisms must do several things to be genuinely effective rather than just procedurally adequate, right? They must recognize structural inequalities. They should provide free legal assistance for complaints, translation and interpretation services. They should respect cultural protocols for dispute resolution, right? They should address power imbalances between project implementers and affected communities. Confidentiality protections against retaliation, independence from project implementers, right? Community members on review panels, they should provide substantive remedies, not just apologies or symbolic gestures, right? Compensation for losses. There should be project redesign to prevent harm. This is very, very important, right? Because many times the mechanisms for providing accountability, right, is that there's just serious limitations and these things take too long, they cost too much. There's no settlement, there's no means of significant number, and this is just creating more environmental injustice, right? So, a successful case study is the case of the Bujagali hydropower project in Uganda. This was another big megawatt dam that was affecting a lot of people, 8,700 people. And the grievance system had community liaison officers in 9 affected villages. And so there were weekly complaint collections, monthly resolution meetings, bringing together community representatives and project staff. And then you had an independent panel for escalation if that local resolution failed, right? So over 5 years, they collected 1,247 grievances. That's a lot, right? Which might sound bad, but I would argue that this high filing rate indicates trust in the system, right? People felt it was worth complaining, right? This project was exceptional. 94% were resolved at project level without escalation. Average resolution time was 21 days. The issues broke down as 48% about land compensation, 27% about environmental impacts, 15% about employment. And that distribution really tells you, what mattered to these affected communities and where friction was occurring. This is really powerful data. And what made this work was that the mechanism was adequately resourced with dedicated staff, right? Officers had regular community presence, not just during complaint windows where they might have just showed up occasionally, right? They had authority to adjust compensation amounts and modify project activities within parameters. Public reporting created that accountability pressure, right? But again, this wasn't perfect. Some people probably still experienced harm. But again, it's an example of a mechanism that functioned better than what the typical practice is. Okay. And when we talk about changing and learning, adaptive management is really that systematic process for continually improving by learning from outcomes, right? Adaptive management is really relevant for safeguards because you're operating under uncertainty about impacts and mitigation effectiveness, right? The adaptive management cycle has 5 key steps, right? So you're going to plan your intervention based on your current understanding, right? Which should be supported by evidence, research, local ecological knowledge, consultation, right? It should have some sound grounding, should be piloted, the methods you're going to use, right? Then you will implement what you planned, right? You're going to monitor that implementation and outcomes. You're going to analyze what is working, what isn't, and then you're going to adapt your approach based on that evidence, right? So again, it's a cycle. The key principle is that uncertainty is always going to be assumed, right? Management actions are treated as experiments. Learning is formalized, not accidental. This very much contrasts with traditional project management, where you plan everything up front, you implement the plan, and then you evaluate at the end, right? Let me repeat that. This is a cycle. It's different because traditional project management, you plan everything up front, you implement it, and then you evaluate at the end, right? So that approach assumes you know enough at the beginning to design everything correctly, right? Are those assumptions often true? Not really. I would argue, right? Adaptive management assumes that you don't know everything, right? And it builds in processes to learn and adjust. Adaptive management originated in natural resource management in the 1970s when managers really realized that ecosystems are far too complex to fully predict how they'll respond to interventions, right? Now you see it more applied across development, conservation, climate work, all kinds of different spaces. But again, the relevance to safeguards is that social impacts are also hard to predict fully at project design, right? Consultation, this might reveal concerns you didn't anticipate, right? Monitoring might show your mitigation measures aren't working. Communities might experience harm you didn't foresee, but adaptive management then provides a framework for responding to these realities rather than rigidly just following an initial plan that turned out to be wrong. And now we're sort of set in our ways, right? This gives you a framework and tangible things for what you're going to do if things go wrong, right? So let me show you how this works in practice, right? So imagine a resettlement project, right? Our initial theory of change assumes that cash compensation will enable livelihood restoration, right? That's a pretty testable assumption. Monitoring then reveals that compensation recipients are spending money on immediate needs, food, healthcare, debt repayment, not investing in new livelihoods, okay? 6 months after resettlement, most households have depleted their compensation and have no sustainable income source. This is a problem, right? Analysis identifies that our assumption was wrong. Cash alone was insufficient without the livelihood training, without market access, without time for people to adapt to new economic activities. Adaptation means shifting strategy, right? So now we move from cash only compensation to an integrated package. We had a plan for this, right? Phased payments so people don't spend everything immediately, skills training for new alternative livelihoods, and agricultural inputs if people are farming. We create microfinance access for small business development. And then the learning means documenting what worked, why the original approach failed, right? What contextual factors mattered, right? This evidence informs similar projects elsewhere. We're sharing knowledge. But there are barriers to adaptive management and safeguards, right? Project approval processes are often rigid. Changing approaches might require going back through approval processes and red tape and bureaucratic challenge, right? Budget reallocations are difficult. Funders hate that, right? And different budget lines have different restrictions. Also, politically, admitting that you were wrong is uncomfortable, right? Project managers will often worry that it will look like failure, right? Donors want to see that their money was well planned from the start. Short project cycles limit adaptation time, right? If your project is 3 years and it takes a year to realize your approach isn't working and another year to implement changes, right? Well, you have very little time to see whether these adaptations actually improve your outcomes, right? These barriers are very real and they are very prevalent, but adaptive management is still essential. And being very transparent, before you start a project that this is the path you're going to pursue, and some cases turning down funding if they're not going to support this type of work, really makes a difference between justice informed and environmental justice work and research and a different kind, right? So something to consider. These are tough decisions, right? And it's not easy. Open standards for the practice of conservation, now I think just termed the conservation standards. This is a tool that can help support this process, right? Empirically through data, through visualizations, right? So this was developed by Conservation Measures Partnership. And this provides a really specific, accessible, and adaptive management framework that is really widely used across the conservation space, right? So understanding this is giving you tools, concrete tools for implementing adaptive approaches. So there's 5 steps and it's an iterative cycle. Of course it is, right? So you're going to assess the situation. You're going to define project scope, identify threats to conservation targets, and analyze the situation using models. You're going to design strategies. So you're going to develop theory of change, identify objectives, select strategies based on threat analysis. There's implementation, where you're going to develop work plans, you're going to allocate resources, you're going to execute activities, and then you're going to analyze and adapt, right? You're going to develop those meal systems, you're going to monitor progress, you're going to analyze data, you're going to learn, you're going to adapt. And then there's share, right? You're going to share learnings. You're going to do collaborative learning with partners, with similar projects, right? We are building a better knowledge system to evaluate effectiveness, right? So this deeply integrates with meal. Steps 1 or 2 are all about participatory assessment and can really be integrated well with participatory assessment. Step 3 is implementation with monitoring, and step 4 is evaluation with learning, right? Step 5 is accountability through that transparency and knowledge sharing, right? The open standards are used globally. Thousands of conservation projects use this framework, and it's free software, right? They have free software called Merati, where you can train local champions, local liaisons, your own staff members, how to, work on a shared platform for visualizing this stuff, making decision chains. And from a safeguarding perspective, that's valuable because it really formalizes adaptive management. It makes theories of change explicit, right? And again, it creates accountability for assumptions and evidence for learning. So there are a few different types of open standard examples, right? You can do threat ranking, which is a participatory process where you with local community members or project stakeholders are going to identify threats to the conservation targets, like could be species, habitats, ecosystem services. Then you're going to score each threat on 3 dimensions: scope, asks what portion of the target is affected; scale, from 1, less than 10%, to 4, more than 75%; severity asks how much damage occurs within the scope, from 1, like slight degradation, to 4, destruction; and irreversibility asks whether damage can be reversed, right? So then the open standards provides a framework and a calculation to really frame this in a tangible way, the overall threat ranking. And this gives you a really systematic way to prioritize where to focus your intervention in a space where there might be a ton of problems. This really gives you a way to be like, okay, this is really overwhelming. We have all these challenges, we have all these threats. How can we rank what we need to tackle first, right? So an example that I can provide you is like agricultural encroachment, right? Scores 3 on scope in a specific, setting, 4 on severity, 2 on irreversibility, right? So that's a total of 9, which is high priority. Illegal logging is 2, 3, 3. That's 8. That's also high, right? Climate change is 4, 3, 4. That's 11. That's very high, right? Tourism pressure we rank as 1, 2, 1. That's 4, medium priority, right? So this is telling us that climate change adaptation and mitigating agricultural encroachment should be top priorities, right? Well, how are those linked? We can think about that, right? We can create leverage points, right? Tourism management matters, but it's less urgent, right? The value from an EJ perspective is that threat analysis can and should include social threats to community well-being, not just ecological. It's sort of expanding that scope to think about social ecological systems and how they connect. If the threat to livelihoods from conservation restrictions is scored as high, well, that elevates attention to safeguards and benefit sharing. You can do results change, which are detailed theories of change, expanding theories of change to try to identify causal pathways from threats through strategies to outcomes. So this really shows the problem side and the solution side, making those connections causal. And you can also do indicator development, right? So a lot of doing work in the environmental space is developing indicators so we can see, how what we're doing is actually creating the outcome we hoped for, right? So indicators should be smart. They should be specific about exactly what will be measured. They should be measurable, quantifiable, or objectively assessed. They should be achievable. Given the resources and time frame we have, they should be relevant. They should directly relate to objectives, and they should be time bound within a time frame for achieving targets, right? Poor indicators are vague. Improve mangrove health. Cool. What does that mean, right? How would you know if it happened? Better indicators are precise. Increase mangrove canopy over 45% to 65% in project area by 2027, right? That's specific, measurable, time bound. You can verify it with satellite imagery or field surveys, right? Another example, benefit local communities. Too vague, right? Better would be increase average household income from mangrove fisheries by 20% within 3 years. Disaggregated by gender of household head, right? Now you know what to measure. the target, the time frame, and you're tracking distributional effects. For safeguards, indicators need to track harm prevention, not just benefits. Zero households displaced without adequate compensation. This measures whether a key safeguard standard was met. 80% of women in affected communities report satisfaction with consultation process. This measures inclusive participation quality, not just whether consultation occurred, right? It's this goes beyond just saying we're going to have some meetings, right? The challenge is that measuring satisfaction, perceived quality, distributional equity is harder than counting outputs. It requires qualitative methods, interviews, ethnography, qualitative analysis, like we talked about, disaggregated data, attention to whose perspectives you're capturing, right? That's necessary for justice informed research and for safeguards to function. Okay. So let me tie all this together, right? How safeguards, meal, participation, and adaptive management connect throughout a project cycle, right? So at project design, safeguard screening is going to identify risks and affected populations, right? Participatory assessment is building a theory of change collaboratively with community members rather than for them. The meal framework is then going to be designed to track both safeguard compliance and outcomes. Assumptions are going to be explicitly documented for testing and should be co-created with all stakeholders. During implementation, we're going to use monitoring to track safeguard indicators continuously. Participatory methods used throughout are going to ensure that community voice is included in data collection and at many stages throughout the process. Grievance mechanisms are going to provide accountability for us and serve as an early warning system. And we're going to be constantly reviewing these and creating opportunities for this. Then data is going to be analyzed regularly, and we're going to make adaptive decisions, not just filed away in reports. At evaluation points, which we're going to predefine, we're going to assess safeguard effectiveness using quantitative and qualitative data if we can, right? And you're going to evaluate whether theory of change assumptions held or were being held or were they wrong, right? And so you're going to learn what adaptations worked and why, not just whether targets were met, right? We're moving way beyond just checking boxes, right? And then we're going to share findings publicly to improve future practice and share these data, these knowledge back with community members, right? This integration transforms safeguards from a compliance exercise at project approval to genuine harm prevention and justice throughout implementation, right? The key is that each element reinforces the others. Participation improves monitoring quality. Monitoring enables adaptation. Adaptation increases effectiveness. Grievance mechanisms surface issues that monitoring might miss, right? Learning from one project improves safeguards in the next, right? But this sounds great, right? This sounds amazing. We need to be honest, right, about why even good systems fail, right? There is this thing called the implementation gap, and it reflects political economy, not just technical design, right? Approval pressures will always be a problem, and they're going to prioritize disbursement over due diligence. This is just the way things are, right? Development banks and donors are measured on how much money they move, right? Staff are rewarded for getting projects approved and funds spent, not often for safeguard quality, right? Capacity constraints are real. There aren't enough safeguard specialists relative to project portfolios. I'm hoping to train more of you to fill these roles, right? Organizations experience turnover and knowledge loss. Training is inadequate for the complexity of social impact assessment and Indigenous rights in many cases, right? Resource allocation reveals priorities, right? Meal systems typically get less than 3% of project budgets. That's insufficient for quality monitoring and participatory processes. Think about everything we just talked about, how complex and big that is, right? And when budgets are cut, safeguards and meal are often the first things to go. They're seen as externalities, extra things that we're doing, to be good, whatever. Grievance mechanisms are often overwhelmed and under resourced, right? Data from Accountability Council reviewing cases from 2019 to 2023 found that 63% of investigated cases involved safeguard policy violations. The most common issue was inadequate consultation, right? Average time from harm occurring to accountability mechanisms and findings was 3.5 years. Think about what that means, right? Communities experience harm. They navigate a complex complaint procedure. They wait years for investigation. And then by the time the findings come, much of the harm is irreversible, right? I mean, these are not aberrations, they are systemic features of how often development and finance of development operates, okay? Standard project indicators will also often miss what matters for environmental justice, right? You need to deliberately track these environmental justice dimensions that we've talked about. Our 5-dimensional framework is really useful in this way, right? Distributional indicators include disaggregated benefit flows, not just total jobs created, but jobs by income quintile, gender, ethnicity, location. This is intersectionality, which we're going to talk about in future lectures. So we're not just looking at income change, but change for poorest households specifically, right? Environmental burden distribution tracking can look at who lives near pollution sources, who loses resource access, who bears health risks. Okay. Procedural indicators, they're going to go beyond counting consultation meetings. Participation rates are going to be disaggregated by marginalized groups. Quality assessment asking whether information was understandable, whether influence on decisions was genuine, right? Whether timing allowed for meaningful input in the first place. Decision making authority, distinguishing advisory input from binding consent. Okay. Recognition indicators track whose knowledge systems are valued, right? Languages used in project materials, integration of traditional and local knowledge into design, right? Respect for cultural protocols and governance system and consultation processes. Accountability indicators are going back to grievances, right? Looking at not just whether grievance mechanisms exist, but whether they actually function equitably, right? Filing rates by different groups. If one group files way more complaints than another group, why? Looking at resolution rates and times critically, right? Like, are grievances from marginalized groups being resolved as quickly as others? Remedy quality, right? Distinguishing material improvement from just symbolic gestures, right? These indicators in environmental justice lens require more effort to develop and track than standard output metrics, right? But they're essential for understanding whether projects are advancing or undermining environmental justice, okay? So you need an analytical framework for evaluating whether safeguard and meal systems will actually function for environmental justice, right? Start with safeguard design. We're all were all applicable standards triggered and assessed, right? Or were some missed or waived? Does the impact assessment reflect genuine understanding of local context, or is it just generic, right? Were vulnerable and marginalized groups specifically identified with appropriate attention to intersectionality? Examine the meal system, right? Are indicators smart? Do they include qualitative measures? Does monitoring include community-based components, or is it entirely external, right? Is the evaluation design capable of detecting harm, not just benefits? Do learning mechanisms have institutional support, or are they just add-ons that will be cut if budgets tighten, right? You have to ask these tough questions. Assess participation, right? Where does the project fall on the participation spectrum? Inform, consult, collaborate, or empower? Were multiple methods used to reach different groups, especially women, youth, marginalized populations, folks experiencing disability, right? Do communities have decision-making authority, or are they only advisory? Evaluate accountability, right? Again, is the grievance mechanism accessible without barriers? Are there protections against retaliation? Can the mechanism compel remedies, or does it only just recommend actions that can be ignored, right? Check adaptive management. Are assumptions explicit and testable? Are they smart? Do approval and budget structures actually allow mid-course corrections, or is the plan locked? Is learning valued institutionally, or do staff fear that reporting problems will harm their careers or their job security, right? Run through this checklist systematically, co-create this, right? It will quickly surface where these gaps exist, right? Make this standardized. But ultimately, this is not so easy, right? Institutional reforms are needed. Individual projects can be improved, but system level change requires institutional reforms. Let's just be very honest, right? Incentive structures need to reward quality of safeguard implementation, not just disbursement speed. Career advancement should be based partly on community feedback, right? If you're working in this space, not only on project completion metrics, right? Resource allocation must change. Best practice suggests that minimum 5% of project budgets for meal systems should be allocated. We should have more dedicated safeguard staff, not just adding responsibilities to already overloaded portfolios of people who don't actually have the training in this, right? Long-term funding for grievance mechanisms should be given more focus, right? This should extend way beyond formal project completion because impacts will persist, right? Approval processes need reform, right? Independent safeguard review before project approval, not just staff assessments. Community right to decline FPIC or renegotiate projects, not just to be consulted. We should have safeguard triggers, and they should be genuine decision points where projects can be rejected or redesigned, right? Not just procedural hurdles to navigate. Transparency must be standard. Public disclosure of all project documents in local languages, not just English and official languages. We should have real-time monitoring data accessible to communities, accountability mechanisms for finding published data promptly, not delayed for political reasons, right? These reforms face political resistance. Slowing approval processes, shifting power to affected communities is key. But again, it makes compliance harder, right? They're necessary for safeguards to function as intended rather than being just legitimation theater, but it's difficult, right? We need structural and systemic change. So I've given you some case study examples of how to put all this together. I'm going to give you sort of a hypothetical with some questions in the assignment dealing with green finance of how this puts everything together as an activity that you can engage in, right? But again, let's think that, at their best, safeguards and meal systems, they're justice tools, right? They redistribute epistemic authority, challenging whose knowledge counts, right? They create transparency where opacity served power. They can provide mechanisms for remedy where harm occurs. They can enable communities to say no to projects affecting them. But in the same turn, at their worst, they can legitimate harmful projects through procedural compliance. They can extract community knowledge without sharing power. They can create an illusion of accountability without substantive remedies, right? They add administrative burden without changing outcomes. The difference lies in implementation, whether participation is genuine or performative, whether monitoring is actually capturing what communities define as important or just standard indicators, whether grievances lead to real changes or symbolic responses, whether learning translates to different practices or just better documentation of the same mistakes. Your work is to develop the critical analytical skills to distinguish effective safeguards from this legitimation theater, and the practical skills to design and implement systems that genuinely advance environmental justice. These systems are imperfect, let's be honest, right? They operate within larger structures that concentrate power and resources, structural injustice. They can't fix everything wrong with development and conservation paradigms, right? But they can make harmful projects somewhat less harmful, right? They can create space for dialogue and for effective communities to negotiate better terms. They can build evidence for why certain approaches fail and alternatives succeed, right? That's not nothing. And in contexts where communities have few other forms of leverage, safeguards and meal systems, they really matter, right? So your role is to make them work better, to close these implementation gaps, to center justice rather than just compliance, right? Again, thanks for your attention. You really can make a difference in the future. And again, I look forward to your questions, seeing how you apply these frameworks. And again, always accessible in office hours. Let me know. Thanks for your attention.